Now we have time for some questions. It's an opportunity to get information on how these kind of ideas of investment can affect the Icelandic market. Someone has a question? Then maybe I should start with one to Annie. To what extent does your organization, are you a leader in this, or are you following, for example, the Norwegian Oil Fund in their policy and vision on these matters in investment?
So I know we have a Norwegian here, so I have to be careful what I say. I think on this issue in particular, the coal, certainly our decision came before that of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Other investors in Norway had also begun to exclude coal companies. The difference was that they had the other investors that had done this, one in particular I'm thinking of, they didn't publish the names of the companies that they'd excluded, and they hadn't excluded all of the coal companies. And so I think that might have limited their influence in that respect a bit. In terms of do we follow the Sovereign Wealth Fund more generally? Yes. Most of the municipalities actually that are members of KLP have it in their guidelines that they will follow the exclusions of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Not just for, the coal exclusions have not been released yet, to be clear. But exclusions related to human rights, to the environment more generally, to weapons, that is pretty much universal in Norway and seen kind of as a minimum standard. In fact, when we're talking to small municipalities that manage their own assets and they don't have the resources to have dedicated staff to work with social responsibility, that's always the advice we give them, is to follow those, because they do produce open decisions as well, so the reasoning behind it is very clear.
Thank you. Yes, Ásbjörn, please. You might want to comment on this.
Yeah, a related issue. I think it's a good opportunity to mention, and that is on coal divestment and actually divestment from all types of fossil fuels, because we often hear that there is no systematically mispricing of fossil fuel companies. Don't believe that necessarily, because if you hear that, you should check. Well, obviously, this assessment is based on some type of carbon pricing path into the future, because this industry is sensitive to the carbon price, especially coal. So ask yourself, what is the price? Or ask the ones that are saying this. Ask, what is the carbon price you are billing on making this assessment? Because if you are building on, like now in the European trading market, you have like 7 euros a ton of CO2. Maybe that is correct. There's no systematically mispricing. But if you wanted to go for 2 degrees and even more, even less, you would rather need 40 or 50 euros a ton of CO2. So that is the relevant question. Would you like to invest in coal, oil, and gas if the carbon price was like 50 euros a ton? So please do that check if you hear that, because I think the financial market is really not up on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are still open. We very much like to have a little bit more discussion on this. This is an emerging issue in Iceland. We'll probably see some changes in the coming months, on years, on how investments are made. We have, for example, in Iceland, we have the pension funds being the strongest investors, could we say. They have many people are looking into what will be the changing role of the pension funds in the financial market in Iceland, and how they are many, for example, and they are small in relatively speaking towards, for example, your funds. So they might not have the resources to do their proper investigation on those. So there are many actually issues. If there are not other questions, I would actually like you, both of you, if you would, based on your experience, what would be the 3 most important recommendations that you would give for Iceland, could we say, to move more into a scenario that you have been describing on making investment decisions based on climate issue and maybe also on corporate social responsibility. I know it's putting you on the spot, but you might have it in something in mind that is important in your opinion. Could you do it for us? If 3 is a lot, maybe 2 is enough.
Yeah, let me try to start at least. You said 3 recommendations, right? Well, as I mentioned in my talk, this is a lot about climate risk management. So my first advice would be build competence. Gain more knowledge on this. What are the likely challenges? What are you facing? What are your opportunities? How can you manage those? Because even if there's a lot of uncertainty, there is also a number of issues we are rather certain on, as we have mentioned here. You can build on. And then in terms of investments, I think you should also then build on the natural resources you have on Iceland. You have competence in natural resources in certain directions. And in my mind, for instance, renewable energy would be a major, that's a blessing for Iceland, because you have all this geothermal energy. You have hydro, and I'm certain that you could develop those resources much further. And you might also add other resources, renewable energy resources that you could develop, not only for benefit of Iceland, but also if you do this well, for instance, geothermal. This could also, maybe it's already is an expert technology for you, but I'm certain that could even be increased. So at least that is, 2 recommendations. Let me think about the third.
Oh, thank you very much. Annie.
Okay, so I have to begin with a caveat that I don't know exactly the kind of the investment profile that Icelandic pension funds and financial institutions have. So what I would suggest as a general level, I mean, on the first point, I'm going to echo Asbjørn's point about competence. And in that respect, I would say one thing that we found really helpful in developing our strategy was talking specifically to civil society actors and to government institutions for more advice on this. So it doesn't necessarily, for institutions that maybe don't have the resources to, bring in new people and all that, you almost certainly have a wealth of knowledge around you in, environmental NGOs and also in your the environmental authorities for the Icelandic government. And that's something that we found really helpful. And on the second point, not knowing whether divestment is a possibility for you or kind of the number of companies in your holdings, I would say my advice would be to tailor an engagement strategy to the kind of investment profile you have. So for example, if you're an institution kind of similar to, like in Norway, we have Folketrygdfondet, which has a very small number of holdings, maybe 30 to 40, something like that, of Nordic companies. They're not making exclusions, but that means on the flip side that they have quite a lot of influence in the companies that they're invested in, and they really have the opportunity to push for change. And so that's something that I would recommend, is kind of looking at even companies that you say are doing pretty well. What do they have, what could they improve on even more? And as a substantial owner, you'd have that kind of leverage. I think the third comment I would have would be on impact investment, specifically in infrastructure. I mean, this is an environment where fixed income investments have not been as promising in the last couple of years as they have been previously, and I know that pension funds specifically are looking to alternative sources of generating yield. And in that respect, the kinds of infrastructure investments, whether that's kind of things that you could do in Iceland that are related to renewable energy and energy efficiency, or if you venturing abroad and not even necessarily to developing countries, there are opportunities elsewhere. But I think it's also a good point to kind of leverage the kind of competence that you already have here and renewable power is clearly one of those areas. So those would be my 3 pieces of advice.
Thank you very much. Now, yes, there is a question. And please introduce yourself and point the question towards the one who you want to answer.
Yes, my name is Hildur Knudsen. I wanted to ask Annie if you've specified how much of your portfolio you invest in renewable energy.
Okay, so I'm going off of my memory now from because we looked at this specifically when we did our overview, and I'll have to double check it, but I think it was somewhere between 3 and 7% in renewable energy totally. And this is something we're working on. We're actually going to start reporting more systematically on renewable energy because, as you can imagine, it's a little bit of a difficult question, technically deciding where to draw the line in terms of investment in renewable energy companies, and then what do you consider a renewable energy company, and then obviously we have the hydropower bonds. So that's something that we're looking at figuring out how to do in a more standardized way so that we can report that and the fossil fuel investments. We do report in our annual report on these investments through Norfund specifically. But obviously our portfolio with 3,500 companies, that includes quite a few other companies that are engaged in renewable power generation.
Thank you. Now maybe there's time for one more question. Yes? Here it is.
Yes, hello, my name is Hrönn. I am from Reykjavik municipality. I was interested to see that the Oslo municipality wanted to follow KLP, and I would like to have a comment on that, how that has been going, and yes, if it's something more that you could explain for Reykjavik to learn.
Yes, so the Oslo Pensjonskasse, they manage their own pension assets. And the reason that they chose our approach, they developed it also before the Sovereign Wealth Fund came with their, with the 30% line. And the reason they chose ours is because it was so open. The study that I told you about, looking at our investment strategy and the background to developing that's about 40 pages or so in Norwegian. That's all up on our website. So I think they felt very comfortable. They don't have a lot of dedicated staff that can work with this as well, and it seemed, I think they thought this sounded like a reasonable solution. And as far as I know, that's gone really well. In terms of what they'll do once the Sovereign Wealth Fund implements its exclusions, I don't know. If I had to guess, I would imagine that they're going to follow that as well.
Thank you. Well, yeah, then the final question.
Thank you for your interesting lectures. My name is Bilge. I work for Resource International. I wanted to ask Annie, before the pension funds are investing, they definitely need information on what type of organization they want to put their investment in. Are you seeing any increase in reporting on carbon footprint from companies or greenhouse gas inventories so you would be able to make your decision?
I didn't catch one of the words in. Are we seeing any increase in what?
Companies reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions or carbon footprint?
Yeah, so, well, the first point I would say is that for the majority of our assets that are passively invested, we're actually not looking at the companies beforehand because it's pretty automatic based on, the size of the company, whether they come into the index or not. So with 3,500, that would have been quite a few to look at in advance for a team of, I think we have 60 people employed in KLP's asset management division in total. But your question or your comment about reporting is something that is very important to us. And as I mentioned, we're the Norwegian partner for CDP, and that's been our mission all along, has been to try to encourage companies to report to CDP. And that's the CDP data is kind of the raw data that we use in finding our carbon footprints. And we do see a bit of an uptick in this. Before I left For Iceland this week, I received a list of all the Norwegian companies that did not report to CDP, so they can expect a letter from us in a few days. But we do see, especially at a global level, that the amount of reporting is increasing, and also CDP has some really interesting initiatives going to try to also improve the quality of their data. And because, since companies are reporting themselves, it's more difficult to standardize it, and also to estimate carbon emissions in cases where companies don't report. And this is something that third-party service providers already do. True Cost, South Pole, a lot of these already, investors are using them to calculate their carbon footprint. But CDP is going to be doing this as well, and it's going to be more difficult then for companies to kind of hide and avoid reporting. So, we've always been very clear that this is something that we see as important, regardless of the stance you take on what they ought to do with that information. It needs to be out there.
Thank you very much. And now we are at our time limit. On behalf of Landsbankinn, I want to thank the speakers very much for their presentations. For the guests for coming, thank you very much. And for Landsbankinn for hosting this event. Thank you very much and have a good day.